Blood of Dragons, Volume 3, An Evening to Remember. Chapter 1. For the first time in her life, or at least in recent memory, Sophia didn't feel like drinking. It wasn't that she didn't want to. Far from it, in fact. No matter how she tried to raise the flagon in front of her and drown her thoughts in the honeyed liquid, all she could see was the dozens of bodies scattered about the roadside, and the bloodied figure standing in their midst. The colour of the mead swirling in the flagon reminded her all too much of the golden armour of the Aldmiri Dominion soldiers after being coated in their wearers' gore. Slowly, as her thoughts tumbled over themselves, her fingers stopped the mesmeric circling of her drink as it continued going stale and warm. It had been an interesting couple of days to go along with the month that she and Kaius had been working and travelling together. Since they had met, Kaius had seemed content in doing random jobs around the city. Chopping firewood, delivering packages, harvesting crops, repairing buildings, and whatever else helped earn them both some coin. One day, as she came back from collecting a minor bounty of clearing skeevers from basements, she had found him working away at War Maiden's smithy, helping the owner Adrienne temper and sharpen a batch of gladii to deliver to the Legion. Even for the days that followed, where they had managed to earn enough to equip themselves better than in rags and scraps, there was no sign of the terrifying nature of her travelling companion. No task was beneath him, no job too small to undertake, and while she knew it was mostly to work on his reputation in the city, there was a general undercurrent of kind-heartedness that almost seemed out of place in the war-torn province. But then came the bounties they undertook together. The bandits at the two camps in the old ruins to the northwest and the old iron mine to the north. She should have realized that there was something subtly wrong about Kaius then, but she had been too in awe of his fighting ability. It had been insanity each time that he had simply wandered into their camps, demanding they leave the province or surrender, but each time it had been overwhelmingly effective. Sure, the bandits had laughed in his face and threatened all sorts of nastiness to both Kaius and especially herself. Sure, they had made a fight of it, but in the end both of them had returned, almost entirely unharmed, and pockets and pouches full of trinkets and the bandits' ill-gotten gains. She should have known that there was no one that good. With sword and bow and a bit of magicka, they had managed to collect bounties on 24 bandits, where over the months previous she had been limited to the occasional highwayman. Between the bounties and the past month working together, they had both warmed up to each other in ways that only fighting by someone else's side could. He was still a cold, sometimes miserable bastard who kept to himself, especially when compared to his polar opposite in Sophia, who bounced around like a Khajiit high on skooma. Underneath it all, though, she had seen glimpses of the man under the mask. Several times he had proved that the kindness and generosity that had resulted in him providing his own shirt off his back was a deeply ingrained character trait. But so was his sense of humour, his personal honour, and an indefatigable will and drive to succeed. He was by far the best person she had spent any length of time with, and even to herself it wasn't surprising that he had become the first that she had spent more than a night or two with in several years. It had helped immensely that the money and the subsequent booze that it purchased went a long way towards quietening that whispered warning in her mind that there was something not quite right. It was a voice that she had gone out of her way to drown in alcohol with every available opportunity. The trouble was that experience had shown that every time her mind had thought something had been too good to be true, it was eventually proven correct. Despite all this, it still didn't stop her from grabbing her things and following along after Kaius, as he travelled at the behest of the Jarl's wizard to conduct an archaeological expedition. Using the term expedition very, very loosely in this case, as it soon turned out. Grave robbing would have been a better way of putting it, and if she had known exactly what she was getting herself in for, she would have upended herself into a flagon and waited for Kaius to return. Part of the sarcastic, dry humour that she was beginning to thoroughly enjoy from Kaius had left him describing their contract as a merry jaunt through an ancient Nordic crypt. She knew better. It wasn't the first, second, third, or even the 20th time that she had dived into the depths of one of the hundreds of ancient barrows with their restless dead in her life, and she knew roughly what to expect. Between the handful of outlaws camping in the upper levels, the dog-sized frostbite spiders in the middle, and the living and yet not Draugr every bloody where else, it certainly wasn't boring. The tavern was increasingly busy, the crowd growing in number, and she started as the door closed suddenly as the wind caught it. Like the other times, after delving into the 3,000-year-old barrows, it would be days before she wasn't feeling on edge. Draugr, ancient mummified beings from the long-lost Nordic kingdoms and dragon worshippers, were unnerving to be around, especially how the difference between one that was properly dead and one that was undead was determined by whether they would lunge at you when you got too close. No matter how many times that happened to her in all of her adventures into the tombs, it was still just as terrifying as the first time. And that was not to mention the giant frostbite spider of all things. How in the hells did something that size get in there? For a moment she found herself brushing away the phantom strands of the webs, and she swore to herself. Frostbites the size of mastiffs were bad enough, but at least they were easy to fight and deal with. One the size of a mammoth was the stuff of the worst kind of tavern stories, by those who drank more than even she did. But always Kaius was there. Kaius the shadow that would block a sword wielded by a dead man. Kaius, the armoured figure that drew the dripping arachnid more towards himself to allow her to stab something vital. Kaius, the man that no matter what, ensured that he wouldn't let anyone else do something that he wasn't prepared to do himself. Kaius. Kaius the vampire. After the previous day, there was no longer any denying the fact. Her heavily scarred, highly skilled, incredibly strong, brave, and somewhat attractive travelling companion was not human. He was a vampire who had seen decades, if not centuries, pass him by, and who had obviously been roaming the lands of Tamriel for the nine only knows how long. While a lot of the mysteries around her strange travelling companion had been answered, there had been many more raised in their place. The scars? That was an easy enough answer at least. Anyone who seemed to go out of their way to fight things would suffer some form of injuries from time to time, especially if they had the luxury of several lifetimes to do so. It also answered why all the scars that he had on his body seemed old and faded. As he had grown more experienced and skilled, the number of wounds he would suffer dwindled to almost nothing. His skills, strength, and speed? Easy. It was obviously a result of his nature. So was his abilities to hide in the shadows, and even in plain sight. But several questions nagged at her mind. First and foremost, just how exactly was he able to just waltz around in daylight? It was unheard of. None of the stories or tales or legends ever mentioned a vampire roaming around in daylight. Yet, here he was, somehow finding the light more agreeable than what she did. He had a better tan than most people had outside of Hammerfell. And then there was his complete and utter hatred of elves. No, not elves, she thought to herself, as she swirled her finger around the moisture on the lip of her flagon. The Aldmeri Dominion, especially their Thalmor agents. That shouldn't have been that much of a surprise, though. Everyone hated the Thalmor. The Nords hated them for taking away their god. The Empire hated them for starting the Great War in the first place. Everyone else hated them for being such arrogant bastards. Oblivion take them, even the Thalmor hated each other. What she had never seen was anyone hate as fiercely or terribly as Kaius. The way that he picked that fight with that contingent of justiciars, the way he toyed with them, goading them on, was somehow more terrifying than the way he tore them apart. She had tried drinking the thoughts away, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was unusual to say the least, as she couldn't remember the last time she managed to go a whole night being sober. But sober she was, and filled with images of death and horror was her mind. The location of their contract, Bleak Falls Barrow, was located near the village of Riverwood, 2 days' travel to the south, along some of the safest and most well-travelled of roads. Roads that they were returning along to Whiterun with the fruits of their labour in the dark. They had even been making good time, walking, chatting, and even singing from time to time. Well, Sophia was singing. Kaius was just walking along as he usually did, but all the fun and frivolity had ceased when they had come across the group of Thalmor, escorting a mass of prisoners. The look on Kaius's face had told Sophia more than what she wanted to know, and for the first time since they had met he was angry in a way that numerous bandits, spiders, and undead had failed to achieve. Somehow the hatred was even more terrible than the sight of the 36 elves escorting the sorry collection of individuals shackled together, the latest victims in the anti-Talos purges as the Dominion enforced the White Gold Concordat. Such prisoner trains and representatives of the Dominion were increasingly commonplace throughout Skyrim, and was one of the many reasons why the Stormcloak Rebellion was supported as much as what it was in the province. In many ways, the Empire had lost the Great War despite the devastation inflicted on both sides in the resulting stalemate. Through treaty and ink, the Mede Empire had spent over 20 years being forced to ban its patron deity, and while unofficially most turned a blind eye to Talos worship, the Concordat did allow the Dominion to enforce it across Tamriel. Justiciars, the agents, hunters, and not-so-secret police of the Dominion and the Thalmor ruling class were a well-known presence, especially in the province that had birthed and given rise to the man who had long ago ascended to godhood. They roamed from city to city, town to village, seeking out hints of outlawed worship and arrested everyone they found. The prisoner train Kaius and Sophia had encountered was one of the larger ones, consisting over 100 manacled and chained men, women, and children, dressed in rags and heads wrapped in stifling hoods. They were making their way south to the Cyrodiil border for punishment. After all, it was typically easier to dispose of people outside of their homelands. Even then she had been blind to the truth. The sight of children being whipped and dragged along had been terrible, but she should have noticed that Kaius was not just angry at their treatment. The rage that consumed him had left him shaking, which should have been enough for her to know that something was wrong. Before that point, she had never even seen him show much emotion at all. "Stay here," he had told her, reaching under his breastplate and pulling his amulet out so that it hung freely and in plain sight. "You don't want to be involved in this." Out of shock and confusion more than anything else, she watched as he casually strolled down the road, whistling obnoxiously loud and not bothering to make way for the column of golden-armoured figures and their bedraggled prisoners. Almost sickeningly curious, all she could do was watch as one of the mounted Thalmor rode over to him, ordering him to step aside before catching sight of the amulet and barking orders to the rest of the Thalmor guards. The fact that Kaius was smiling when the Thalmor went to arrest him should have been a warning to them all. Chapter 2. The Bannered Mare. In less than 5 minutes, there wasn't a single elf left standing, or in most cases, alive. He had annihilated them, slaughtering the entire guard detachment with a sickening ease, and in some of the most brutal ways she could have ever imagined. The first died when his own dagger was ripped from a sheath and cut his throat clean away. The second fell backwards, half a second later, with the same knife spearing an eye. The mounted justiciar slid out of his saddle, trying to stem the bleeding from his thigh after Kaius stabbed deep into his hip and groin. Before they had even realized they were under attack, 6 of them were dead or dying, and it wouldn't end until none of them were left standing. He took them apart, figuratively, literally, and messily. Elves were naturally quicker and more agile than humans and Nords, but to Kaius they were little more than lumbering orcs with no grace at all. He cut throats, gashed open bellies, stabbed eyes, and hacked into groins. Arms were broken, knees were shattered, blades turned aside, and armour completely ignored. Almost as though he was made of liquid, he flowed through the massed ranks of the Thalmor, sliding his blade through their guards in a display of skill that was impossible to believe if she hadn't witnessed it. Even as they began panicking and calling upon their magical reserves, he countered and slaughtered them. Bolts of flame and crackling arcs of lightning splashed harmlessly against wards that were almost contemptuously called into being. Each had been perfectly timed, and not even the years Sophia had spent in the College of Winterhold had she seen such skill with spells. Before she had fully realized what had happened, let alone moved towards the group to assist him, it was all over. The Thalmor were dead, or very close to it, their bodies scattered about in various degrees of intactness, and where their blood covered the better part of 2 acres of road. Only the rows of huddling, terrified prisoners screaming through their thick, blinding hoods were left amongst the lake of spilt gore. Through all the shock of seeing or watching a one-man massacre unfold, Sophia was left standing as though she had stepped into a paralysis rune. When the justiciars had moved to arrest Kaius, and against her better judgment, she had drawn her sword and moved forward to assist. Witnessing him in action, though, had left her a witness only instead, her sword hanging limply in her hand as every elf messily died. A field of gore and broken bodies was all that remained in the sickening minutes in the one-sided battle, but the truly shocking sight was saved for last. Initially it appeared as though Kaius and the last justiciar, a Thalmor officer in a rich black and gold high-collared robe, were embracing as though they were lovers, but such an illusion was short-lived and fragile. The taller Mer had been feebly thrashing, trying to pull Kaius away, and the reason why was evident as Kaius ripped his mouth away from a ruined, bloodied throat. Eyes as black as the deep winter nights, fangs pale and gleaming like glaciers of the north, and the blood stained everything. Clothing, armour, flesh. Kaius's teeth especially were stained with the gore of fallen elves, and was as changed as his eyes and teeth, twisted, misshapen and corrupted, tightened around bony protuberances and a skull more Daedra than man. The smile he wore as he finished draining the last Thalmor dry of blood could be explained as purely vampiric, but fanged or not, there was no mistaking the fact that he'd relished what he had done, even as the man resurfaced from under the mask of the monster. In the day since the slaughter, Sophia had repeatedly convinced herself it was shock that made her follow him. Shock that made her stand there, seeing the way his face twisted and returned to the calm, rugged and grim man she had known for the past weeks, before he went from prisoner to prisoner, breaking chains of his sword or unlocking shackles of stolen keys. Shock that left her shaking, picking her way through the ruins of the elven enforcers as Kaius told the utterly bewildered men, women and children directions to the near Stormcloak territories, and bidding them good luck. In all the chaos and confusion, with their heads covered in leather hoods, none of the prisoners had been able to witness Kaius killing over 30 of their captors, or what he truly was. As a result, and between the disorientation, the shock and adrenaline, not a single one thought to question Kaius's explanation that the rest of the ambushers had already left before they vanished into the woods. Neither Kaius or Sophia said much after that. Both of them preferred to travel in silence, and she couldn't help but sense that he was somehow feeling guilty or embarrassed at what had occurred. It certainly didn't help that by the time they had arrived in Whiterun, the great keep of Dragon's Reach was closed to the public, which meant that delivering the hunk of stone they had pried from the wall in the barrow to Farengar would have to wait until morning. So, despite her growing fears, trepidation and unease, she found herself once more within the cosy walls of the Bannered Mare, staring into the swirling depths of her flagon. It was better to look at her drink than the figure seated on the opposite side of the table, or the awkwardness that filled the space between them. "Hopefully Farengar pays us as much as what he promised," Kaius muttered, his fingers tracing over the 3,000-year-old claw mark like lettering and map of the province engraved on the aged, polished obsidian. "As fascinating as this is, it's useless to us, and I doubt that we could find a buyer willing to take it off our hands for even a fraction of what he offered." For all the fighting and horror that they had endured over the previous days, from giant spiders to the undead, the several kilograms of polished obsidian appeared to be nothing special. Little more than a worthless oddity, only the Jarl's wizard Farengar, with his apparent obsession over the long-extinct dragons and their worshippers, had offered a considerable amount of septims for its acquisition. More septims, in fact, than what they had collectively earned for the entire month that they had worked together. The dragonstone was indeed fascinating, but a sickening kind of fascination was more prevalent for the man who currently studied it. His voice, before the situation of the elves, had been strangely soothing, but now it let fear coursing through her flesh instead. There was nothing unnatural about him, no sign of the monster that he truly was, and if she was to be honest, she was having difficulty pairing the man sharing the table to the creature that had slaughtered the elves. The sensation of eyes on her flesh made her unintentionally twitch, and she couldn't help but glance up at him. The eyes that had, less than a day before, been whirlpools of darkness and horror were now their customary soft and brown, showing no hints of the darkness that dwelled within. Especially how he looked apologetic at her reaction, sighing heavily and sliding the heavy stone block back into his travelling pack under the table. "Look, you have nothing to fear from me," he said, scratching at the stubble under his jaw absently. "Despite what you might think, I'm not going to hurt you." "I find that a little hard to swallow." "It's true, though." Kaius barely even batted an eye to Sophia's words, the tone and sarcasm rolling off him like the rain. "I'm not going to hurt you in the slightest, but I understand if you don't want to travel with me anymore." "So I can simply get up and walk away, and you won't stop me?" There was a brief nod after he took another mouthful of his drink. From the smell, it was some kind of potent brandy. "Yeah, although I'd feel bad if I was the only one of us who ends up taking all the payment for this thing." The solid thump was audible even over the background noise of the tavern as he tapped his fist against his pack. Silence fell between the two of them, and Kaius seemed to make a point of not staring at her, instead roaming his eyes over the dozens of patrons in the tavern. It was something that she was thankful for, as meeting his gaze was uncomfortable to say the least. A question was burning within her, though, a question that despite her discomfort couldn't be contained, and after taking her first mouthful from the flagon of the evening, she stared at him with unbridled curiosity. "Just how long have you been doing all this?" "What do you mean?" "This." She gestured to him, herself, and the pack containing the dragonstone. "Adventuring." "Long enough." There was a hint of sorrow in his voice as he leaned over, dipping his finger into his drink and using the moisture to draw on the table. Before he wiped it away with the palm of his hand, Sophia saw the number 200 written on the table's surface and couldn't help but shudder. It explained so much, but there were dozens of unanswered questions left in her mind. Why? Why do I roam the lands adventuring? A hint of a true smile broke through the melancholy that was infecting him for the moment. Because there are a lot of things in this world that require a hero, and there are far too few heroes around to undertake them. And you are one of these heroes? As quick as it had appeared, the smile faded and a sense of sorrow returned. For a moment he sat in there in silence, looking down at the beads of moisture on the polished wood surface. I used to be. Sophia chewed a lip and thought. When he spoke, there was nothing of the vampire that she had seen on the road. Only the man remained. It wasn't helping her mental state that the sheer amount of emotions churning inside her ranged from pants-shitting terror to the mirrored sense of sadness that seemed to permeate from him. What are you now? Someone who still hopes to do something good in this world, Kaius snorted, glancing around the room before taking another mouthful. Or at the very least, doing something useful. I am serious, though, burning with the unusual intensity. His eyes returned to her, and he stared for a moment. If you wish to leave, you can leave. I won't stop you or harm a hair on your head. I know that my word is probably not worth much after what's happened, and what you know now, but I will split our earnings evenly, and you can be on your way. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me? His laugh drew the attention of several of the nearby patrons as he nearly choked on a mouthful of his brandy. Well, no. That's why I didn't say anything. And that's also a pretty good reason for not telling anyone either. No one will believe you, and those that do aren't going to be interested in your health. Like the Thalmor? Anger, pure and a reflection of the rage that had left 3 dozen of the elves splattered across the road, rose to the surface, and she couldn't help but flinch away from it. They are a good example. I'm very close to the top of their shit list. After what you did and how you reacted to them, I'm not surprised. Look, this is neither the time nor the place for any serious discussions. Too many ears around. Let's just say that anything to do with the Aldmiri Dominion and myself is not beneficial for anyone who wants to remain on Mundus. I have my reasons for wanting every single one of those Vithrellan dead, and if I had the power to do so, let's just say there wouldn't be many left breathing. Some other time I'll explain a bit more, but that'll depend on whether you want to continue working and travelling with me. Despite all of her feelings, she knew that she had already come to a decision. Looking before leaping was never her style, and it had been exactly what had gotten her into this mess in the first place. What was concerning her more than anything was that she knew that despite all of her fear and terror and unease, there was a large portion of her that trusted Kaius. I think I'll stay. Really? For the first time since meeting him, Kaius seemed positively surprised, a smile cracking through his goatee that was finally shared by his eyes. Yes. I didn't actually expect that. Look, when we first met, I was honest at least with how it isn't any fun on my own. Somehow, such a simple admission after her decision seemed to bleed the tension out of her like a throat wound, and she flicked a ponytail over her shoulder. You have been keeping me company, and it's nice to have someone who's willing to look out for me for once, even if they are more dangerous than a pack of starved saber cats. I'll take that as a compliment. It sort of is. I've never encountered anyone like you before. Her finger returned to circling around the lip of her flagon. Before I met you, I was wandering around Skyrim killing bandits who thought I was an easy target to claim their bounties, meeting the locals, making new enemies, and generally making a nuisance of myself. You know, all the fun stuff. All of that was after I spent a few years studying at the College of Winterhold, if I use the term studying very loosely, of course. I have been able to tell you have some magical ability, he added, listening to her every word. Going to the college wasn't my first choice, she continued, pointedly staring at the table and her flagon. Wasn't even a second or third choice either. I had no place to go, and it was either that or live in a cave. So I learned a few spells to keep them happy. I must admit, though, that learning to blow stuff up was pretty fun. Unfortunately, my genius was wasted on them, and I was kicked out after making a spell that destroys people's clothes. Never would have thought the mages were such prudes. So, it turns out I ended up living mostly in caves anyway. The sense of sadness and the involuntary shiver of the memories returned, and she tried to hide the fact from Kaius, who was sitting quietly, listening to her. Only the tiny movements of his arm, bringing his flagon to his lips, broke the illusion of him being anything more than a statue made of flesh rather than stone. You seem like a funny person. You mean like weird? Despite herself, she felt anger rise at his words. There are already enough people who make fun of me because I don't try to conform to their ridiculous ideas. I didn't mean it as a bad thing. Kaius looked legitimately apologetic, giving her an honest smile. It makes you different. You might think so, she replied bitterly. Everyone in Skyrim is like an exact replica of each other, always bragging about themselves, saying how beautiful or tough they are. I would never do that. An eyebrow raised, and he seemed to chuckle under his breath, making her roll her eyes. Yeah, okay, I know what you're thinking, but in my case it's actually true. Other people really do kid themselves. There was still a tenseness between them, which unusually for her didn't involve him looking upon her lustfully, or her to find a bed for them to share. All of her attempts to tease or manipulate him over the previous weeks had been so far about as effective as if she had attempted to do so to a Dwemer animunculi. The worst part of it all, though, he truly did seem to care, and even seemed to understand who she was. That all by itself was equal parts infuriating and scary. Look, for as long as you want someone to watch your back and share your spoils, I can hang around. Like I said, you don't need to fear me or worry about sticking your neck out while I'm around. I'm not like that. The hidden meaning was all too obvious to her, and she couldn't help but rub the portion of her neck not covered by her leather armor. If she was going to hang around with him, she was going to need to invest in a gorget or something, for the peace of mind at the very least. Seeing her unease, he tilted his head back and drained the last of his drink, wiping his mouth and gesturing to her mostly untouched flagon. Would you want a fresh one? Or are you content on trying to solve the mysteries of Nirn and that one's depths? I'm fine with this one. Her mouth was dry, and she felt like she'd been drinking dust washed down with molten lead. It was so unnerving, the difference between Kaius the man and Kaius the monster. I'm going to go get myself a refill, he said simply, sliding his feet to the floor and rising from his chair. I'll be back in a moment. Chapter 3. Mikhail. Like usual, Kaius seemed to disappear from sight, fading into the press of people with barely a ripple of movement. Sometimes Sophia would have sworn Kaius was able to merge with the shadows or turn into mist with how easily he could vanish at will. There was so much she didn't understand about him, so much that didn't make any sort of sense, and right on the top of that list was the sword and axe-headed amulet and his hand on its handmade leather loop that he never took off. Just what kind of vampire worships Talos? She muttered under her breath, staring into her flagon at the honeyed liquid contained within. As far as taverns went, the Bannered Mare was one of the better establishments in the city, and one that Sophia had only been thrown out of a handful of times in the past. The mead was typically good, the crowds not so rough around the edges, and there were always an easy mark or two that Sophia could seduce her way into the coin purse of. It especially helped that Hilda, the owner, and the other barmaids such as Sadia kept the typical women of the night outside, which always made it easier for Sophia's tricks and wiles. Tonight, though, they were far too busy with a larger-than-average crowd, practically run off their feet serving meals and drinks to their customers. It was truly busy, filled with a growing chorus of chattering, talking, oaths, stories, and increasingly drunken singing as she sat there, feeling amused at herself that for once she was neither in the mood for a night escapade, nor needed to access someone else's purse to pay for her mead. Tonight's choices of music and entertainment, however, while an improvement over the usual songs and epic poems so enjoyed by the peoples of Skyrim, was still grating on the nerves. For once, it wasn't another God's damned rendition of Ragnar the Red, but through the conversations, singing, and the bustling movement of dozens of tavern patrons, something entirely different reached her ears. God's blood, let me be. Obviously feminine, and with a tone that instinctively knotted her stomach, Sophia couldn't help but sigh and watch as one of the dozens of women that made Whiterun her home tried to move around a table near the bar. Carlotta Valentina was one of the many well-known merchants with a permanent stall in the market square, selling the baked goods from the 3 best bakeries in the city. Sophia had a soft spot for the young widow, and unlike some of the others, only occasionally stole a sweet roll or two. but there were others whose interests were far less savoury. With a pair of plates of food, one for herself and one for her daughter, she was attempting to move through the crowd to her table, while also attempting to shake off a pair of hands grabbing at her dress. Hands that were attached to one of the local bards and minstrels that Sophia knew all too well, and for all of the wrong reasons. Womanizer was one of the politer names Mikhail had throughout the city, especially in the Plains district. Sophia had several names for him, and one of them rhymed with hunt. Any woman of even passable attractiveness was fair game for the local bard, and so far at least he had been too cunning to try his luck with any of the married women. His caution was warranted, though, especially in a society and culture that responded to such dishonourable acts with an axe to the face for the perpetrator. This, unfortunately, meant that Mikhail preferred to go for the more vulnerable women in the city, who had no one to support them. Several months earlier, shortly after she arrived in Whiterun, Sophia had been the object of his unwanted desires before she convinced him that healthier prospects lay elsewhere, at sword point. Sooner or later, though, the bastard would lose interest in whoever he was courting before returning to Carlotta, making the woman's life a constant nightmare. "You know you want me, Carlotta." Stumbling through the press, Sophia could see that Mikhail had been drinking through his performances, and despite the relatively early hour, he was slurring, and well on his way to drunkenness. "Stop denying it. Just, please, leave me alone." Trying her best not to react, Carlotta was doing everything in her power to ignore the groping attempts of the bard, wooing her, placing the plates of food on the table adjacent to the bar. Her expression may have been an attempt at a reassuring smile to her daughter, who sat in one of the chairs, but anyone who bothered to look could see it was forced. For her part, the tiny girl was simply watching her mother and the man partially stumbling after her, legs dangling and kicking from the all-too-large seat with all the innocence of youth. A yelp of surprise, a slight clatter of a plate precariously close to being dropped, and Carlotta was yanked backwards, being twisted around by the larger Nordic man as he forced her to face him. While her expression appeared to be carved from the stone mountain Whiterun was built upon, Sophia couldn't help but see the fear in the imperial woman's eyes. She was trying to pull away, trying not to look at him, and wordlessly pleading for help all at the same time. Those bystanders closest to her, however, were torn between their desire to intervene and the bard's connections with the seedier elements of the city. "My daughter is right there," Carlotta moaned, both as a plea and a desperate warning as she tried and failed to twist out of his grasp. "And so, I'm not interested in her, I'm interested in you." Sighing, Sophia went to put her flagon down, paused, and thought better of it before starting to rise from her seat with it still in her hand. Mikhail was a bastard 7 times out of 10 and an arsehole for the other 3, but this was the furthest he had ever pushed his luck. Alcohol and the confidence of someone with his associates nearby were pushing his actions far across a line. There were easily a dozen or more people standing around Mikhail as he pulled Carlotta closer, his hands grabbing and tugging on places that he shouldn't, but the line for intervention hadn't been reached yet for them. Sophia's line for getting involved was different, especially how it had been recently shifted somewhat by a combination of frostbite spiders, Draugr, and a day-walking vampire with a sociopathic hatred for the Ardmeri Dominion. Even before she could push her chair back, Mikhail lunged forward and kissed Carlotta drunkenly, cutting her complaints and disgust with his lips and pulling her tighter until she dug her fingernails into his face. Pain seemed to be the only real deterrent for the arsehole, and while Sophia knew this from experience, it seemed scratching was just as effective as cutting him with a dagger. Carlotta wasn't carrying a blade, but as she staggered against her table with a clatter, a battered tavern fork appeared in a shaky hand, as though it was a sword. "You fucking bitch." The scratches were minor, barely even leaking blood, but it had enough to change his lust into rage as he saw the streaks of red on his fingertips after probing his face. "You are going to pay for that, you whore." There was no time to move, act or intervene as the enraged bard drew his arm back to strike her with all the force he could muster, and the slap of flesh on flesh ripped through the crowd like a snap of a siege trebuchet, plunging the tavern into silence. Sophia had barely managed to disentangle herself from the chair and push through a pair of caravan guards, but somewhere in those moments, someone had stepped between the terrified stall owner and the livid bard. Sophia hadn't seen her companion since he had vanished to get another drink, and somehow, yet again proving his ability to disappear and reappear, Kaius had been the one to intervene. The loud, painful slap that had cut through the noise and chatter of the crowd had not been Mikhail striking Carlotta in the face, with presumably enough force to knock her to the floor, but instead the sound of Kaius catching his hand in mid-motion in a grip that could have crushed the Jarrell Mountains. "I do believe the lady asked you to leave her alone." It wasn't even directed at her, but Sophia shivered at the way Kaius practically growled the words at the surprised bard, all the while taking a mouthful from his freshly refilled flagon with the other. Releasing his grip on Mikhail's arm, Kaius stood between them and Carlotta, who seemed shocked that anyone had actually come to her aid. The looks of concern from the other patrons were ignored as they glanced between them, Mikhail, and the trio of his friends as they rose to their feet, but Sophia knew that the casual stance was an act. The look in the vampiric adventurer's eyes was a perfect copy of the expression she had seen just before he started gutting justiciars. "Who the fuck do you think you are? Do you have a death wish or something?" "She told you to leave her alone, so I think you better do it." For most people, the glare the drunken bard directed at Kaius would have stopped them in their tracks as his anger erupted out of him. But Kaius's smile only grew larger, more confident, more chilling and threatening. "You have balls, I'll give you that, but that fiery widow is mine." The bard laughed in Caius's face, jabbing a finger at Carlotta, who was trying her best to keep her daughter calm against the rising tensions growing in the room. "She doesn't want you, and she's not yours." "Oh yeah?" They were already standing close together, but Mikhail closed the gap further until the two men were standing almost nose to nose, inebriated rage radiating against cold confidence. "She'll be mine. I'll conquer her like any true Nord conquers any harsh beast." The Pale, with its vast glaciers, were warmer than the expression growing on Caius's face. But there were hints of amusement within his eyes and the twitch of a smile in his goatee. Without removing his gaze from Mikhail's, Kaius took one last mouthful, licked his lips, and placed his flagon onto Carlotta's table behind him. For anyone unfamiliar with the two, Mikhail would have been the favoured opponent for any bets, with his broad shoulders and good hands difference in height to his goateed opponent. Even for a bard, Mikhail's Nordic heritage ensured that he stood strong and powerful. But dressed in travelling clothes and a simple cloak, Caius's own physique was entirely hidden from view. A physique that Sophia had come to know was very, very capable, even without his vampirism. "You have 5 seconds, friend." Like a slug, the words slid out of Mikhail's mouth as though he was going to leave a trail of slime down his shirt. "To remove yourself from my tavern." "I'll give you 3. Sophia had to suppress a giggle at the way Caius glared at the Nordic man standing in his face, and the cocky, confident smile that was 99% challenge. From the moment she met him in the stables, let alone seeing him with his shirt off and the bounties they had gathered since, Sophia knew that Kaius was not the sort of individual to cross. Watching him annihilate more elven soldiers and agents than there were people currently standing in the Bannered Mare in the day past only reinforced the knowledge in her mind. 1, Mikhail growled, drawing out the word far longer than he needed to, until it devolved into a low hiss. Kaius simply stared at him with the impassive mask of an expression he seemed to wear as often as his cloak. 2. For a moment, Mikhail seemed to hesitate, something within the depths of his mind trying to make itself heard through the fuzziness of the booze and failing. an instinct, or a warning from his subconscious that he entirely chose to ignore. Suddenly, and without bothering to finish counting, he rolled his hip, bowling his fist, and threw it right into Kaius's face. Chapter 4. Thugs. Several of the nearest witnesses winced at the sound of hardened knuckles hitting a cheek, and through the tavern the background murmur was silenced as though a string cut with a knife. The punch had been quick and full force, but Kaius was still standing. Mikael might as well have punched the mighty Gildergreen tree in Whiterun Central Square, as Kaius took the blow that rocked his head back, but otherwise not flinching. It was a solid, powerful punch with Mikael's full weight behind it, leaving the shorter man worming his tongue into a cheek and rolling his jaw. Even those unaccustomed or inexperienced with fighting could see that Kaius had intentionally let the punch connect, allowing himself to be struck in such a way that left his face swelling and growing pink, but otherwise ignoring it. "That was your one free hit," Kaius growled, "and you wasted it." In panic, Mikael threw another punch, rocking forward in an experienced brawler's stance, but Kaius wasn't going to let him have another opportunity. To Sophia and the other witnesses, he simply seemed to explode into action, twisting and dropping down lightly to deflect the wild haymaker before slamming a fist of his own into the Nord's stomach. The fight that some were expecting was over in seconds. Kaius victorious, and Mikael left whining and struggling in a grip stronger than iron. Sophia had seen paper folded up less thoroughly compared to Kaius gripping Mikael's shoulder and arm from behind, twisting the bard up in an experienced and inescapable arm lock that kept the two men at arm's reach apart. "I do believe the lady deserves an apology." "Fuck you." One moment they were locked together, facing towards Carlotta and her daughter, and the next Kaius twisted, swinging Mikael around and slamming his face into the wall. The fleshy thump rattled some of the plates and flagons on nearby tables, but Mikael's cry of pain was louder and heard by everyone in the room. "There are children present, shitsack." Again, Mikael found himself facing Carlotta as she tried to simultaneously shield her daughter's eyes and flinch away from the two men. "Apologize." Between the moans and the congested, groaning exclamations of pain from his broken nose, Mikael spluttered something that was definitely not an apology, before his face was reacquainted with the wall for a second time. That wasn't polite. Millimeter by millimeter, Kaius was applying pressure to the bard's shoulder, wrist, and elbow as he forced the struggling Nord into stillness and onto his knees. A task made all the easier by Mikael's increasingly dazed state from being forced to headbutt the wall. "Apologize, or Hulda will have a new window in here." I'm sorry." "You're not apologizing to me." Shifting his weight and grip, Kaius twisted Mikael forward into a half-kneeling, half-prostrated position facing the cringing widow and her daughter. "Apologize to them." I'm sorry." "That's better." Something as small and simple as a curl of a mouth shouldn't have been intimidating, but Sophia shivered as she saw the expression of enjoyment just under the surface of Kaius's face. There was definitely a part of him that enjoyed hurting others, but she wasn't entirely sure whether it was handing out justice or the pain itself that twisted Kaius's lips into a grim smile. "Now, you were going to leave her alone from here on in. If I catch even the slightest whiff or hint that you act or treat anyone like you have done, I will personally ensure that the guards will have to use a mop and bucket to clean up your remains. Understand?" I understand." "Good." The deep hiss that crawled out of Kaius was somehow as chilling to Sophia as the memory of him ripping the arm off one of the elven justiciars on the road as he relaxed his grip, letting the injured, blood-faced bard slap onto all fours. "But just so you don't forget." The thud of flesh this time round was not as loud or table rattling as the others, but it was no less effective as Kaius punched Mikael in the back of the head, leaving the Northman sprawled face first onto the floor. "I'm sorry for my rudeness. It was almost as though the bard no longer existed as Kaius stepped over the prone form, picking up his flagon from where it rested, and giving a soft, confident grin to Carlotta and her daughter. I hope I didn't scare either of you. I'm fine. While she was breathing heavily, shaking from the stress and trying to run her fingers comfortingly through her daughter's hair, Carlotta nodded her thanks to the man who had come to her aid. Thank you. It's always a pleasure helping those in need. I'll be around to make sure the lesson sticks, but I doubt you'll have any more trouble from him. As though he was simply talking about the weather, Kaius took another mouthful of his drink, meeting Mila's frightened gaze and sticking his tongue out to ease the young Imperial girl's fears as she sat on her mother's lap. The tiny girl, while just as distraught as her mother, beamed a smile, returned Caius's wave as he turned and began walking towards Sophia and their table. Well, that was fun. All around them, the crowd suddenly shuffled away, clearing a wide open space in the middle of the tavern with the two of them in the centre. In weary resignation, Caius breathed out a deep breath, seeing the way Sophia was looking over his shoulder at the source of armoured boots on wood. How many of them are there? 3. Again, the fact that he was smiling should have come as a warning, but Mikhail's companions unfortunately couldn't see it with his back to them. Care to join in? Before she could even answer, one of the trio at Caius's back growled, cracking his knuckles loudly while the other two looked around the crowd, daring them or anyone to try to intervene. Is she with you? The tone was guttural and thick, the accent of Whiterun hold slurred somewhat by Mead, but the threat was inherent enough in the words. If the slut knows what's good for her, she'll stay out of this. Or, even better, she can wait her turn, so we can take turns with her. Braids and tattoos, furs and muscles. The 3 of them were larger and burlier specimens than the usual inhabitants of Whiterun from the nature of their jobs, which also meant that getting their hands bloodied was a daily expectation. It also meant that their crude humour was not an idle threat, but a promise they intended on making good. Almost any other time she would have considered being a willing participant to such activities, if her temporary companions had a modicum of decency at least. These, however, were the type that found out the hard way that her sword was not just for decoration, and she was very, very capable with its use. A bar fight was also something that she enjoyed on a semi-regular occasion, even with a trio of underworld enforcers that were more likely to stick knives between ribs than stick to using fists, but the expression on Caius's face stilled her blood. Something within him was building. A shadow had darkened his eyes, and a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head did more than enough to chill her to the core, and dampen the rush of pleasure at a potential fight. Everyone is so rude this evening. The sigh that bellowed out of him as he turned was tinged with regret and annoyance. That was entirely uncalled for. I think you all should apologize to my friend. 3 against 1 was never fair odds, but 30 massacred elves had proven to Sophia that he could handle more than 3 thugs. They didn't know that, though, and instead his attitude was perfectly infuriating. You come into our tavern, onto our territory, hurt our friend, and expect us to apologize? While shorter than the leader of the trio, the shortest of the thugs were almost equal to Kaius in height, with a mass of tattoos fighting for space across his visible flesh. That's not how this works. I don't suppose we can agree that the piece of shit had it coming. Kaius was continuing to sip away at his flagon, gesturing to the still unconscious Mikhail on the floor with his empty hand. No one had bothered to move to his assistance, and if anything, those within the tavern were gradually stepping further and further away from the 4 men squaring off in the room. No one touches with us without compensation. They especially don't touch us unless they want to get taught a lesson. Okay, lesson learned. For a few short moments, Caius fumbled around with one of the small pouches attached to his waist, extracting a coin and flipping it through the air to the trio with a thumb where it was snatched out of the air. Even from a distance, all in the room could see the obvious gold colour of the septum as the burly leader opened a paw of a fist that had caught the coin. "You misunderstand this situation you're in, milk drinker. We're going to extract our friend's payment out of you in blood." "Oh, that's not a payment." Hand on hip and looking into his flagon, Kaius swirled the ruby amber-coloured brandy contained within, without even looking in their direction. "That's to cover the costs for your healing at the Temple of Kinnereth." All three men bristled with anger, glaring with murderous intent at the totally unconcerned Kaius, who took another mouthful of brandy. There was a heightened sense of panic growing in the tavern now, many within realizing lines had well and truly been crossed, and Sophia could see Hilda gesturing frantically for Sardia or one of the other barmaids to fetch the guard. Such a task wasn't going to be easy, as there were a dozen or more people attempting to find a quick escape from the expected fight, or milling around watching or blocking the way out of the tavern. "All right then," Kaius said, wiping his mouth with a grin. "Let's get this over with." Bounding forward on the balls of his feet, a vicious jab with his free hand snapped through the air, smashing right into the mouth of the trio's leader. There was no hesitation, no moment of placing his flagon down before Kaius had struck, and in front of a tavern full of the evening's patrons, the towering Nordic thug collapsed like a felled pine. Glasses, plates, and metal flagons rattled and chimed as the impact of 120 kilograms of towering Northmen rippled through the wooden floors, leaving everyone, especially the now unconscious thug's companions, stunned. A single hit, a single solid punch to the face from an adversary 2/3 his size had left him unconscious, mouth bleeding and teeth loosened, and not in the condition to rise any time soon. The floodgates were opened and a tide of violence ensued after only a most momentary of pauses, and Sophia watched with growing excitement as the two thugs threw themselves at Kaius. Punches, kicks, grasping hands, and even a thrown bottle were added to the swirling storm of violence as they fought, but it was entirely one-sided. Kaius quickly proved to be as insubstantial as the air itself, evading blows, twirling and almost dancing between the two toughs, exchanging punches and kicks of his own while ludicrously holding onto his flagon. He was even going as far as taking sips from it, as his opponents were left to pick themselves up off the floor. "Such a fine establishment, providing drinks and a show," slurred a man standing by Sophia's side. Like many of the others witnessing the obviously one-sided brawl, there were hoots and calls, exclamations of surprise or praise for particularly impressive moments, and strikes from Kaius, in winces of pain as his own struck home. Especially at one point where he dropped all pretense and slapped the smaller thug across the cheek with his open palm with the sound of a cracking whip. "Ooh, that was a good one," laughing at the sight of the thug picking himself up yet again, while clutching a face already growing a red welt in the shape of a hand. The man at Sophia's side lifted the bottle of potent-smelling alcohol to his lips and took a massive draught. Judging by the rosy complexion and the fact that both eyes were struggling to focus, he had obviously started drinking several hours ago. "Your friend is one hell of a fighter." Even if she hadn't fought alongside him for the past month, Sophia would have had to agree with the drunk's statement, especially as Kaius flicked away a powerful right cross and headbutted his opponent in the face. By now, even to those least experienced in fighting, there was no doubt that he was drawing out the fight for his own amusement. Sophia, however, was left increasingly uncomfortable as she recognized moves and skills that he had used for more violent and bloody outcomes than humbling a trio of Nordic gangsters. Her own knowledge and perception of fighting allowed her to see which moves that, if we're a little bit more serious, would have sent both men to Aetherius to dine with their ancestors within seconds. Despite the darkness of her thoughts, she couldn't help but enjoy the fight. Kaius's skill in most things appeared to be superb, and at one point he even danced around his attackers as though he was a Cyrodiilic nobleman at a ball twirling his partner. He alternated between throwing punches with his free hand and kicking the armoured Nord's legs out from under them whenever the opportunity presented itself. It left both of the thugs increasingly infuriated, and the crowd growing louder and louder with laughter and applause. But it didn't last forever, or anywhere near as long as what everyone would have liked. Within a few minutes, and as the pair of Nords began to tire, Kaius returned to the offensive, battering his way through their defences and leaving them both out cold on the floor. One had tried to tackle him as he smashed his fist across the other fighter's face, but Kaius had simply twisted aside, using both his and the semi-flying thug's momentum to help him along his way. The resounding thud of the last fighter smashing into the bar was felt through everyone's boots as he joined his comrades in blunt force-induced sleep. "It is important for a warrior to be victorious," Kaius called out over the sudden hush of the crowd within the tavern, holding his arms out and turning slowly to look at the men and women standing around him. "But it is far more important for the warrior not to spill his drink." With a wicked grin that showed a mouthful of teeth, he upended his battered flagon into the tavern's hearth, pouring the brandy that it still contained in a spluttering roar of flames and sparks. Throughout the whole fight he had not loosened his hold on his flagon, and judging by the amount he had poured out, not a single drop had been spilled either. This, Sophia realized, was something that truly ate away at her, and was the only uncomfortable aspect about Kaius that niggled at her brain. He wore masks. He obfuscated his identity, who he was, how he thought, and every facet of his being was constantly being tailored to those around him. Surrounded by the natives of Skyrim, people who enjoyed a good fight and respected martial prowess, something as boastful and grandstanding as fighting against two assailants while drinking was almost the epitome of their culture, and they loved him for it. Perhaps, Sophia thought to herself, she would have felt more comfortable if she continued the routine around her, wearing masks to influence and manipulate her. She had seen the way that he'd subtly relaxed around her, though. He spoke plainly, even when a change or tone or words he used could have manipulated her to his advantage. She was more than experienced enough with wearing such masks herself, to cloak her thoughts as easily as she cloaked her actions and body while lifting coins from someone else's purse. And that, perhaps, was the reason why the two of them had worked so well together. In each other, they had found something similar, a mirror that they didn't need to conceal themselves to be around. Chapter 5. Sam Guinevere. A tap on her arm jolted her out of the depths of her thoughts and back into the battered mare, startling her for a moment before realizing that the man by her side was attempting to gain her attention. Like most of the other patrons, he had been watching Kaius's fight with the thugs with considerable enjoyment, but unlike everyone else, he was already as drunk as what Sophia typically was at the end of her nights in a tavern. That, and unlike all the others, he had a keen, curious interest in her, while she had been staring off into the distance. "You look like a lady in a desperate need of a drink." A glance to her still mostly full flagon and the mead within, slowly growing warmer with every passing minute, left her chewing her lip in thought. The colour still reminded her all too much of the elves left fertilizing a couple of acres of Whiterun hold, and as a woman who needed a bottle of mead to start the day, being off-put by alcohol was a new experience. "That would have to be the understatement of the era, I think," she said in reply, looking the man in the face and seeing how he was somehow even shorter than she was, only just coming up to her forehead, but for the moment he was of little interest. Fading through the crowds in the direction of the bar, Kaius was moving with a distinct purpose, receiving more than just a couple of pats on the back or patrons raising their flagons in toast as he passed by. Knowing what she knew about him in the month past, she would have been more surprised if he didn't end up offering to pay Hrilda for any damages that had occurred during his fight. Whatever the case was going to be, at least the mood in the tavern had been lifted. It was no longer filled with a foreboding and cautious feeling that weighed as much as her chainmail shirt, but instead contained a celebratory feeling that even the appearance of a handful of city guards did little to squash. "Well then, perhaps can be of some assistance." Every word slurred out of his mouth, as though his tongue was made of soaked wool. "I'm Sam." "Sam?" Curiously, she looked between the way he swayed on his feet and glimpses of Kaius being the centre of attention of the newly arrived guards. The way they were gesturing and trying to make sense of what had happened meant that she was without his presence for a few minutes at least. "Yeah, Sam Gwevine." Half leaning, half swaying, he looked over her, ignoring everything except for her mostly filled flagon that he seemed to try and fail to focus on with one eye partially closed. "You don't seem to be in the mood for a bit of revelry, are you, miss?" "Sophia," she replied, shuffling towards the table and returning to her seat. The mead tasted a bit off. "Yes, I have noticed that the hunting brew stuff has been tasting terrible lately." Either not caring or not noticing the lack of invitation, he swayed and staggered over to the table before nearly falling over as he sat down. "Maybe something got added to their latest batch. Or it just normally tastes like piss." Laughing again, his inebriated smile was as large as the bottle in his hands as he lifted it to his lips, before taking several shuddering gulps. "Oh, don't I know it? Terrible quality stuff." Neither of his eyes appeared to be wanting to work with the other as he leaned forward, thumping the sizable bottle of alcohol into its wooden surface and pointing a finger at her. "What about some fun? A friendly wine drinking contest." "What's the prize?" "Besides more wine for a lovely lady?" Despite the time for the evening, Sophia was stone-cold sober. A truly unusual situation, and traces of opportunity were creeping into her mind as she studied Sam. To say that he was drunk would have been a vast understatement. He was also at the point of being unable to hold on to Nern with how much the world was spinning around him. "How about this? Whoever wins gets to keep my staff." For once, a potential drinking partner wasn't speaking in sexual euphemisms, and Sophia's eyes studied the long wooden staff attached to Sam's back in its worn leather travelling case. Only the head of it, and a dozen or so centimetres of elegantly carved wood, was visible outside the leather, but it was more than enough for the temptation to creep in. Her years in the only magically aligned organization in all of Skyrim allowed her to appraise the value of what most people would consider to be little more than a walking stick. It was enchanted, the head carved into the shape of a half-opened rose, and easily worth 2 or 3 dozen gold septims from half a dozen buyers in Whiterun alone. In fact, with the right buyer, she could probably swindle more coin than what Farengar was offering for the Dragonstone. A drinking contest. A barely conscious magicka user versus a habitual alcoholic. If Sophia wasn't the sort of individual that had no issues walking down the street nude, it would have been a shameful competition to take part in. Then again, fair fights was something that Sophia believed occurred when one of those taking part was being an idiot. "Sure," she replied. "You don't really stand a chance, though." "We'll see about that, my lovely." The chuckle was as slurred as his speech was, and the grin was just as large as it was before. "We shall see." Somehow he leaned over, his hand groping only twice before managing to grasp Sophia's flagon and upend its contents into a pot containing a set of hardy but long-suffering mountain flowers resting against the wall. It was all the more impressive that despite his condition, he managed to get more of her mead into the pot rather than all over the floor and himself in the process. This is a special brew, very strong stuff." The bottle was large, made of glass, and in keeping with the richness of his robes and the nature of his enchanted staff, was extremely expensive in appearance. Such travellers were frequent within Whiterun. However, the alcohol was certainly not, and judging by the smell of the ruby-red liquid that poured from the end, it was very potent. Sophia wouldn't have been surprised in the slightest if it had the capability of fueling smelters with a flame hot enough to melt orichalcum. especially by how mind-meltingly drunk he already was after consuming just a quarter of the bottle's contents. If anything, the hardest part of this contest appeared to be keeping a straight face as she practically stole the staff from him. "Let's get started," he said, pulling a mug from within the depths of his robes before wiping his hair back with a hand slightly stained red from spilt wine. She watched with some amusement as he concentrated so hard that his tongue was sticking out of the corner of his mouth while carefully filling his mug and her flagon to the brim. "Down the hatch." Together they lifted their drinks and gulped them down, Sophia's eyes widening at the taste and the sheer potency of the whatever the wine was. It was warm and filling as mead, as smooth as Blackbriar Reserve, and with the kick of that special spiced wine she had acquired once. Even for someone as experienced as her with drinking everything that Tamriel had to offer, it was unlike anything she had ever tasted. "What is that stuff?" Idly, she wondered whether even she should have eaten something first before starting. The wine was powerfully strong. Her flagon slammed down hard into the table, and Sam leaned forward, his bottle sloshing as he tried to his mug sloshing as he tried to refill it without spilling it everywhere. "I'm not entirely sure. Found it a little while ago, and decided that tonight was as good as a night as to try it out." He paused, squinting at the fading label that had long since given up the fight against the march of time in an attempt to unravel its secrets, before giving up with a refilled mug in hand. "One down, my friend, one down." Swaying backwards and ignoring her almost entirely, he raised his mug and practically poured the liquid straight down his throat. "And another one for me." Burping loudly, he laughed, with some of the liquid streaming down his chin as though he was a recently fed vampire, watching and waiting for Sophia to have her turn. It was impossible not to remember the sight of Kaius ripping his teeth out of a golden-tanned Altmer's throat before licking his lips clean of the blood that stained them. And how about you? Are you sure you're okay to continue?" "Don't you worry about me. It's just been a long day." Laughing off his question and expression, she gave him one of what she knew was her most enticing smiles, while raising her flagon in a toast. "Here's to a second drink." Before she could bring the flagon to her lips, a hand seemed to conjure itself into existence, clasping over the mouth of the flagon so suddenly that several mouthfuls worth splattered her chest. It was calloused and rough, attached to a person that she was increasingly knowing all too much about. "Kaius? What the fuck?" At some point, his questioning by the guard had finished, and now they appeared to be in the process of dragging the still unconscious bodies of Mikhail and his friends. Kaius, however, as was increasingly his habit, had appeared as though conjured and without warning. One minute she was about to drink some of the exquisite wine, the next he had caught her flagon in hand in a solid, unyielding grip, without any noticeable cause or explanation until she saw the expression on his face. There was no trace of the joviality from before, or the enjoyment he had gained from the fight. Now, instead, he was regarding her new drinking partner with hooded eyes and an enormous amount of suspicion, especially staring at the staff attached to Sam's spine. Draugrs, house-sized spiders, and Thalmor prisoner trains had not given him pause or concern for even a moment, yet here he was, standing so taut and tense that Sophia could hear his flagon creaking in his fingers, leaving indentations and crushing it out of shape. "Weren't you ever told not to drink with strangers?" Kaius muttered, neither releasing his vice-like grip on her drink or taking his eyes off Sam as he spoke. "There's nothing wrong with a little drinking contest." Tugging futilely, she found her flagon was trapped in his hand, locked in place so tightly that she couldn't even shake or spill its contents. "Especially one that I was going to win. And there are some fights that are impossible to win, especially against ones such as this." With an expression that was both filled with amusement and disappointment that their game had been interrupted, the short Breton rolled his head drunkenly towards Kaius. The alcohol in his body was so potent that it was practically oozing its way out of his skin, while he moved like a puppet, with half his strings cut, being controlled by someone sedated by canis root. His eyes, however, widened as he looked Kaius up and down. The look of recognition was immediate, but not as noticeable as the way that the shorter man leaned back, straightened up, and lost a large amount of his swaying, unsteady nature. His eyes refocused, the drool from the corner of his mouth vanished, and in literal seconds Sam had gone from being on the brink of falling into an alcoholic coma to becoming almost entirely sober. "Caius? By all the mead and Sovngarde, is that you?" There was a pause, the eyes looking Caius up and down several more times before he slapped his thigh with a laugh. "It is. I haven't seen you in what, 2 centuries?" Quicker than his eyes could see, and cutting him off in mid-breath, Caius kicked Sam hard in the shin, causing the smaller man to jump from the impact. There was none of Caius's usually calm, polite nature, and Sophia instinctively flinched at the way he reacted. She did, however, see the way that his expression turned thunderous, eyes darting around the filled tavern and nodding towards the dozens of people standing nearby, in silent threat at Sam. 2 years? While framed as a statement, there was no doubting that the way that Sam spoke, as though questioning Caius's agreeableness to his words, leaning forward and idly rubbing his shin where he had been kicked. For most people, especially those living in Skyrim, such an unwarranted attack would have been a cause for a fight, or even the drawing of weapons. Instead, Sam didn't appear hurt at all from what appeared to be a full-strength kick from Kaius, and was instead appearing extremely amused. What was worse by far was the simple slip-up and the cut-off centuries that Sam had been in the process of muttering, revealed enough to know that whoever he was, he knew a whole lot about Kaius, a revelation that left Sophia feeling very, very wary. "Okay, what is going on? You two know each other?" Somehow the grin on Sam's face was no longer one of pure merriment, but was deeply unsettling, turning to look her in the eyes of his own bright and shining, with no evidence of his previously drunken state. "Oh, Caius and I go way back. Isn't that right, buddy?" Just keep telling yourself that. If words could cut or maim, Caius's tone would have sliced Sam into a neat pile of pieces, which only seemed to amuse the smaller man even more. "Just what in oblivion are you doing here anyway?" "Not being in oblivion, for starters, especially how the drinks and the shows here are much more to my liking. What's the problem? Can't a man have some fun?" "You're no more man than what I am. What are you going by these days? Sam Gwyn? Sam Guian?" All right, you caught me." Both his feet thudded on top of the table, and Sam leaned back in his chair, putting his hands on the top of his head and not once removing the smile from his face. "I must admit, though, watching you fight is always a treat. I haven't had such entertainment for at least a decade." "Just who exactly are you?" Her curiosity got the better of her, and despite Caius's choked exclamation of warning and his nervous expression directed to the nearest tavern patrons, Sophia asked Sam directly, again feeling the strange burning intensity in Sam's eyes as his attention was drawn to her. "Relax, KK. We don't want you having a stroke or something." While his attention was now on Sophia, Sam's gestures were entirely for Caius's benefit, but there was a definite tingle of magicka that crept into the back of her neck and into her molars. "They won't hear us or even see anything out of the ordinary. I know how much you love your privacy and would never dream of breaching it." With his boots still on the table, he gave a theatrical wave and half bow, nodding to her with an even larger, anatomically impossible smile. My name for tonight, at least, is Sam Guinevere, although my friends and those who know me better call me Sanguine, Prince of Orgies, Debauchery, and Revelry." Chapter 6. Sanguine. Sanguine. Sophia's laugh was loud and bordered on a snort that was cut off abruptly as she saw the dark, serious expression on Caius's face as he nodded. Something as simple as a nod should never have made her stomach drop as though a ball of lead had been pushed through her insides. "As in the Daedric Prince Sanguine." Calm down, Missy. As though he was trying to relax a stray puppy before it hurt itself, he waved his hands at her, gesturing about at the strange shimmer surrounding them. I might have a glamour over us, but I doubt your dour friend there will appreciate you shouting through it. So what do we owe the pleasure of your presence? Kaius asked carefully, and Sophia tried to ignore the way that his hand hovered over the hilt of his knife at his hip. Are you here to pull some pranks? 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 A Daedric lord such as myself does not deal in mere pranks. For a moment Sanguin's voice rose to a haughty shriek before he folded his arms like a spoiled child, sighing so heavily that the table shivered. Truth be told, things routinely get a bit dull in the myriad realms, and every few years I pop into Mundus for a holiday. All my favourite things are on Nirn, but pity all this war and fighting business it seems to be going on in these past decades. It's been a while since you mortals let your hair down and had real parties. Caius's expression didn't waver, and Sophia saw how Sanguin's eyes wandered to his sheathed knife before meeting hers. There was a promise of endless amusement in those swirling eyes, and she found herself convinced that it truly was a Daedra sharing their table. This isn't your usual female friend, Sanguin said, gesturing to Sophia. While she's definitely a looker, what happened to Vicky? She's back home. Ah, trouble on the old home front, eh? Even so, I must say I'm surprised to see you wandering about on the surface. You two always seemed so damned inseparable. Winking, he made some squeezing motions with his hands as though he was trying to move Kaius and Sophia closer together. Does she know about you two? Do you think that Sophia would be breathing if we were anything more than travelling companions? Ha! And here I was thinking you knew all there was to know about the Velma. Perhaps you should ask her sometime. You might never know your luck. Does this one know who you are, though? She knows what I am. Wow, and here you sit. Panic threatened to consume Sophia as the increasingly overwhelming presence sitting at the other side of the table turned its attention back to her. You have some balls about you, girlie. Take some advice from an old Daedra, though. If you follow this man, do what he says. You'll live longer that way. Also, the expression that crossed Sanguin's face was calculating despite the amusement as he smiled at Kaius. Don't think I didn't notice you said what, rather than who, there, buddy. Just who is he, then? Sophia said, trying desperately to understand and gain some measure of control over such an impossible situation, watching the way how Sanguin reached over with an arm that seemed to extend and yet not to pick up the bottle. There was also no trace of any drunkenness as he refilled his mug, placing the bottle back with a solid thud that revealed that it refilled itself in the process. Your friend here is very famous. Quite a big shot, actually. That was a long time ago, Kaius added, taking a cautious mouthful from his somewhat crushed flagon with more than just a bit of melancholy creeping into his tone. In mortal years, maybe, but not for those of us a little more enduring. He winked at Sophia, and she felt even more awkward, especially when her flagon slid over to her on its own accord, filled with what was now undeniably her favourite mead, Blackbriar Reserve. Neither she nor Sanguin had touched it, at least not physically, and despite herself she stared suspiciously at how only a few seconds before it had been filled with the potent red wine they had been competing with. It won't bite, you know, although one should always drink in moderation. Blinking, Sophia could feel the onset of a magicka-induced headache, or a hangover of epic proportions as she struggled to remove the after-image of an enormous, clawed hand, the colour of expensive wine that made the mug appear comically tiny. Moderation, Kaius grumbled, continuing to sip his own drink and watching Sanguin with wary eyes. Getting soft in your old age? Ha! There's the Kaius I remember. One of my more recent worshippers created his own little bubble in the myriad realms and named it Moderation. Nice place, although it can be a bit too flooded in wine from time to time. I might like the odd drink, but I don't like being drowned in the stuff. Leaning forward again in a way that practically folded his torso with his feet still on the table, Sanguin poured another mug from the perpetually full bottle and waved the smell into his face as though it was a pot of stew before continuing. Anyway, as I was saying, Kaius here is certainly one gifted individual, slaying monsters, rescuing damsels, and saving the world. All that fun stuff. So how did you two meet? The way that Kaius choked on his drink and the stare that he gave Sophia was clear enough. Keep your mouth shut was written across his face, but it was almost as though he hadn't learned a thing about her. She was many things: smart, beautiful, promiscuous, brave, quite an endless list in fact, but quiet was a word that she could barely spell. Sanguine, however, appeared to be very similar as he drank the wine, smiling with a grin that contained far too many teeth for a normal mouth before going to reply, before Caius cut him off. I needed help with something. Tell her the whole truth, buddy. It's not nice to leave a woman hanging. A faraway look came across Sanguine's face, and somehow Sophia got the image of a contraption of ropes and harnesses that had nothing to do with executing someone appearing in her mind. Caius needed help killing someone. I doubt that Caius has ever needed help killing anything. Ever, Sophia muttered, not quite as softly as she had hoped. Truer words have never been spoken, but this someone wasn't just anyone. Leaning forward over his drink, he covered his mouth from Caius's view, and his voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper. She was a god. Sanguine's tooth-filled mouth stretched even further than it was before as his words left it, and Caius rolled his eyes while pretending to be more interested in his drink. Despite their relative short time together, Sophia could tell that he was on edge. It wasn't as much as a surprise. Everything about the situation was surreally wrong, like that one time she'd tried a bottle of wine flavoured with enough moon sugar that was borderline skooma. The room was spinning slightly, the words and movements of those beyond the shimmering magicka twitching, and with their movements no longer synchronized. And as for Sanguine, he was something else entirely, appearing as the short Breton man with curled hair hanging down past his ears, while somehow taking up the entire tavern's interior at the same time. A god. He killed a god. I find that hard to believe. Oh, it's true. If he wasn't tense before, Caius certainly was now, and Sanguine continued talking, while gesturing to him with simultaneously tiny, yet oversized hands. Look at him. Doesn't he look like the stuff of legends, the type of person to spit in the eye of divinity? She wasn't a proper god, Caius added. Too true, too true. A true god like myself is impossible and is immortal and impossible to kill. Oh, sure, you can beat us up, break our physical forms, and send us scurrying back home, but we'll always be around. But there are ways to, let's say, gain powers for mortals. Some methods are better than others, so don't go round whacking a divine heart with a hammer and not expect it to be deleted from reality. Blood sacrifice and worship seems to work pretty well, though, right, buddy? Despite the humorous tone, Caius ignored Sanguine, which left the Daedric prince pouting for a moment before continuing on with amusement infusing every word. Anyway, true godhood is unattainable, but for you squishy mortals you can get close. At least for most of you, but apparently it's bad decorum to talk about Talos these days. Snorting, he had another drink before continuing, draining his mug in a single gulp. I mightn't like the guy on a personal level, but credit where it's due. But overall, for every other case of mortals trying to step up in universal affairs, there is the whole issue of being mostly invincible. You see, there is a big difference between mostly invincible and all invincible. Mostly invincible means that you are slightly vulnerable, and that is a very important distinction. In what way? It's typically not pleasant to get stabbed in your slightly vulnerable bits. Some people might enjoy it, and I'm certainly not one for shaming someone's tastes and sexual preferences, but typically I'd not recommend it. Even for her, it was obvious the way that Caius was standing, and she could see how the mouthfuls of his brandy only appeared as such. He was sipping his drink, watching, waiting for any moment where he would be required to react. That simple fact was equal parts comforting and concerning, especially how she had no doubt that one of the 17 Lords of Oblivion was sharing a table and drinks with them, and Kaius appeared ready to fight him at a second's notice. So you helped him kill a demigod. In a way. Placing his mug down on the table where it refilled once more, Sanguine wiggled his hands as though he was comparing the weight of two objects, or slowly juggling something. You see, to kill a god, even a half-assed one like the spider bitch, you need some godly powers of your own. Kaius is powerful, but he needed a bit of oomph to finish the job. Some years back he came to me looking for some of that oomph. We first met at my shrine in Cyrodiil, where he summoned me for a favour from upon high to help him on his quest. Favours were exchanged, and I gladly gave him my rose. It was one hell of a way to liven up a stuck-up countess's 60th birthday, that was for sure. Very enjoyable and entertaining. I don't remember it being enjoyable, Kaius grumbled, still staring at the Daedric prince with a considerable amount of disdain. That's only because you don't appreciate a bit of public nudity. The burning gaze of the Daedra returned to Sophia. I wasn't the only one that he approached. As potent as a smidgen of my essence is, he needed a bit more than I could provide. So he approached a few of my kin for their support. Mephala, Narima, and Periite. Even such words had power to them all of their own, and Sophia shivered despite herself as Kaius spoke them aloud. Mephala, princess of murder, deception, and secrets. Narima, goddess of decay, darkness, and rebirth. Periite, lord of pestilence, infection, and contamination. A powerful trio of Daedric princes with all the terrible association of what gifts they could provide someone like Kaius. Don't forget about good old MD. I doubt that he would consider anything I have ever done being a favour for him. Oh, I know that. The laugh from the Daedric prince was terrible, but somehow jolly at the same time. Dagon was pissed when you took his razor. Heard him screaming and yelling even from my side of Oblivion. Pretty sure I'm on his shit list anyway. Somehow, the way that Kaius merely seemed to shrug and sip his drink again was extremely foreboding. The connotations that Kaius had personally drawn the ire of the Daedric Prince of Destruction by stealing an artifact from him was more than enough to fill Sophia with dread. The big red guy? Nah. Sanguine waved his hand at Kaius and chuckled. He's not one for holding grudges. Brother mine might be maim, kill, burn all the time, but nothing sticks for too long. It did miff him a little with the whole stopping his invasion thing and killing most of his followers, but dangle something shiny in front of him and he'll lose interest before you know it. He likes change, after all, and you have proven yourself pretty damn good at changing things. Sophia couldn't help but giggle at Sanguine's expression and the way he strutted his arms in front of his chest and imitated what could only be Mehrunes Dagon. At least until a tap to her leg returned her to her senses. Normally, such a strange fuzziness would have been as a result of the potent alcohol she had drunk so far, but between the flagon of Sanguine's wine and the few mouthfuls of Blackbriar Reserve, she was still very much sober. Being in the presence of a Daedric prince was intoxicating in its own way, and Kaius had subtly and lightly kicked her ankle when her mind began to wander too far. Barley Boy, on the other hand, loathes you. Stretching his back, Sophia felt her stomach roll as she saw the way that the Daedra somehow managed to brush his fingers against the ceiling as he lifted his arms above his head. Despite still appearing human, and a short one at that, Sanguine's dimensions were all wrong. A headache-inducing appearance that Sophia's mind was trying and failing to comprehend. He's pissed that he hasn't been able to bend you to his will. Between you and me, buddy, I think he's worried about you getting yourself killed and being stuck with you for all eternity. Some of us Daedra don't want that sort of trouble on our hands. But don't worry too much, though. In certain circles, you have some influential friends. Get it? Sanguine leaned again, smiling out of the corner of an all-too-large mouth while somehow nudging Sophia in the side with an elbow while not getting out of his seat. Circles? Of hell? I doubt it. Last time I checked, I didn't have anyone owing me any favours. Any other time, Kaius's attitude and insolent tone would have been highly antagonistic, but when directed at a literal Daedric prince, it was terrifying, especially to the likes of you. Oh, how you wound me so! Mockingly, Sanguine pressed a hand over his heart while showing a mouth that was now full of razored teeth. Survive a few 100 years and you'll be surprised how endearing someone like you is to my family. Azura has always had a thing for heroes that catch her eye. Don't ask me why, though. I might be the god of kinks, but my sister seems to love getting involved with mortals as much as I do. Also, don't let it go to your head, but Boethia appreciates you slaying that bitch down below. Vermina a little too. Do you have any idea how annoying it is when your followers mistakenly start giving praise to a different god? There was a snort like a draft horse, and Sanguine pressed a hand to his chest. I have never had such an issue myself, as there's not too many gods or potential gods out there interested in drinking and fucking. However, the amount of times that Bo lost worshippers to her was pissing him right off. Just who was this god that you two keep talking about? The question couldn't be contained any more, even despite Kaius's unspoken warning. The stare that he gave her, though, was somehow even more terrifying than Sanguine seated across the table. No one of any importance. Not any more, at least, Sanguine added with a laugh, a hand somehow coming to rest on Sophia's shoulder that was somehow normal-sized, but large enough to cover her entire shoulder and part of her chest and back. The bestest advice that I can give you in regards to our good friend here is, unless you want to die the most spectacular death possible, don't mess with anyone he loves. Otherwise you'll be lucky to end up as a footnote in a dusty book somewhere. The thought wormed its way into her mind, and she could believe that. Her quiet, powerful companion seemed to have everyone's best interests in heart, but it was obvious that he was not one to cross in any way. Then, as the pressure of the enormous but normal-sized hand lifted and Sanguine leaned back, another thought crawled into existence. Kaius was obviously tough enough and had zero qualms with literally kicking a Daedric prince in the leg, and apparently hunting down and killing someone of comparable power. His reasons to do so also seemed to be motivated by love or revenge, or some sort of combination of both, and once more the sight of the road covered in bodies and blood appeared in her mind. There was a connection there, something tangible, but just outside of her understanding, without more clues. The question that appeared in her mind, though, was very simple. What had the Thalmor done to merit such hatred? Just when I was enjoying myself, something almost resembling pain crossed Sanguine's face as he pressed his mug, again filled to the brim, into his temple, as though fighting off a hangover. Last drinks, is it? There was no denying the hint of amusement that entered Kaius's tone, and subtly he relaxed a little, his face breaking out into the hints of a smile. In a way, every time I find a nice establishment and start to enjoy myself, it seems I get called away for work. The Daedra's shoulders slumped while idly licking his lips. Some mortals in High Rock are trying to liven up a party with some good old Gwyn love, and they're doing their damned best to get my attention. I'd love to sit back and swap war stories, but as usual, I have places to be and parties to crash. A hand that was now 4 or 5 times the size of what it was supposed to be moved and pushed the bottle into the center of the table, its form shifting and twisting like a mirage, and even changing shape in the process. It was tall and expensive, both bottle and label alike, and where the previous one was long since faded and illegible, it was one was proudly displayed the word Shadow Banish for the world to see. Even for a woman as superbly experienced with all sorts, types, and makes of alcohol as Sophia, she didn't recognize it, but knew that it was possibly one of the rarest and most expensive items in Whiterun that night. A token of my esteem. Don't drink it all at once, and it pairs marvellously well with a roast lamb, Sanguine said cheerfully, nodding to Kaius and giving Sophia a heartfelt grin. It appears that someone else will become the bearer of my not quite holy rose tonight, but it certainly won't be you two. Don't be a stranger, though, Kaius. I have a lovely little pocket realm set aside for you, if you ever feel like stopping by. I'll consider it. In a tone that conveyed the complete opposite meaning of his words, Kaius smiled and lifted his drink and toast to the Daedric prince as Sanguine stood up from his chair, ignoring the way that Sophia involuntarily gasped at the sight. Everything about him was wrong, from the way that he had to hunch despite the tall-roofed construction of the tavern, and her eyes were hurting as though she was staring at the sun reflecting off fresh snow. A mouthful of fangs glinted in the darkness in a smile promising an unimaginable self-indulgence in excess, and as she blinked, he was gone, the after-images of an enormous, endless, wine mist cloud, the only trace of his existence. The mild sense of dislocation, however, remained, that, and the expensive bottle of wine from a peerless vintage that Kaius was staring at with wistfulness from the depths of his memories. Is this what you consider a normal or regular occurrence? Sophia couldn't help but see the way that the tension left his body, especially as he thudded heavily into his chair with a healthy distance between him and the now vacant third seat at the table. Sometimes. Blowing out a breath, Sophia looked about the tavern and noted how everyone was going about their business without the slightest hint of what had happened. The enchantments were gone, the stuttering, twitching nature of the tavern's interior fading, and with it the tingling headache that had been creeping into her mind while Sanguine had been present. You are going to have to explain a lot about what all that was about. Not tonight, he said simply, and quietly, as though deep in thought by the way he was staring at the bottle on the table. Maybe once we hit the road. Silence fell between the two of them, their eyes mutually staring at the bottle's presence, the only evidence of who, or precisely what, had happened that evening. Kaius seemed to be staring at the ancient and somewhat faded symbol of the Imperial Legion marked on the label. Sophia was staring at the maker's mark and assessing just how much risk there was in drinking such a gift from a Daedric prince. To oblivion with it. Reaching over, she grasped the bottle and popped the cork, dumping the rest of the mead from her flagon into the pot plant in the process before refilling it with wine. After everything that had happened, and despite how drunk she knew that she was about to get, she knew that this was a night she was going to remember, whether she liked it or not.